To render an animation, you want to save out to an image sequence. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to just save out a draft quality rendering because the full-blown quality at 150 frames would take something on the order of 5 hours to render. I'm going to do a draft quality rendering. Let's do this with Quicksilver in order to do the draft quality rendering. I'm going to be rendering this physical camera here that we previously animated in the chapter on keyframe animation. I'll just maximize that with Alt-W and then play it back. We've got 5 seconds of animation of this very simple walkthrough. Cool. Now let's go into the render setup and choose our renderer. Instead of Scanline, I'm going to choose Quicksilver. Let's go over to the Renderer tab. And the Quicksilver hardware renderer allows us to choose a number of iterations or passes, or we can choose the amount of time we want to spend on each frame. For a draft quality rendering, let's just choose time and say we want to render for 1 second. Again, this is going to be using the GPU or the video hardware. 1 second is probably plenty of time. There are a lot of options down here we can play with to, for example, render with non-photorealistic styles and so on. I'm just going to use the default settings. Going back to the Common tab, we want to set up our time parameters. Right now, we're defaulted to rendering just a single frame. Let's do the active time segment of frames 1 to 150. If we needed to, we could choose a different time range here, but 1 to 150 is what I want right now. I'm going to render out to a 1280 by 720 frame, and that's because I previously chose that in the output size here, 1280 by 720. And then scroll down, and we want to determine our file output. Click on Files, and let's save it into a subfolder. We're going to be creating 150 individual files, one for each frame. And to keep things organized, we don't want to just drop that into the same folder as all these other renderings. Let's make a subfolder. I'll click here to create a new folder, and I'll call it Walkthrough. Then double-click to enter that folder, and we'll give it a file name. We'll call it Walkthrough as well. And this is going to be a series of numbered stills, and it's going to have the format of 4 decimal places. In other words, our first frame is going to be 0001. Just to make it easier to read, I can add an underscore here between the name and the subsequent numbering that will occur. Then I need to choose a file format, and as always, I prefer PNG. Now, you do have the ability to render directly out to a movie file, such as a QuickTime or AVI. I strongly recommend that you do not do that. And the reason is that if anything happens during the rendering, let's say it crashes or you have a power failure or you have to stop the rendering, in the case of the render being interrupted, it's highly probable that your entire movie file will be corrupt. Whereas if you're rendering to individual still frames, you can easily stop the render and then pick up wherever you need to. Additionally, if you save out to a movie file, then your only options there are to compress the movie file at render time, thereby losing quality that you'll never get back, or save out to an uncompressed movie file, which is going to be very large and unmanageable. You could easily have, gigabyte files. And so really, for production, your best choice is always to render out to individual still frames. Okay, when I click Save here, I may or may not get the PNG configuration dialog. If I don't get that dialog, then I'm going to go back into this render output and make sure that I go into Setup and choose the options I want for the particular file format, in this case PNG. RGB 24-bit with no transparency or alpha is what I want in this case. Click OK, and now you can see we're saving into render output walkthrough, and then the file name is going to be walkthrough underscore, and then after that we will have a whole bunch of numbers, 0001 to 0150 for the 150 frames. All right, cool. So we've set it up. We've got our renderer chosen. We've set up our render parameters. We're rendering 1 second per frame. And we've chosen our active time segment. We've chosen the resolution And we've chosen our file output, location, name, and format. With all of that having been done, we can go ahead and pull the trigger here, click the render button, and it's going to think about it for a minute. It has to actually compile some of that information. But now once it's done the first frame, then all the subsequent frames should render pretty quickly. And you can see here we're getting an estimate of how long it's going to take. This draft quality rendering will take somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes to render. We'll check back in when this is done, and we'll load this rendered image sequence into the RAM player in the following movie. All right, so that's the setup for rendering an image sequence.